Emily Munro stood in the middle of the grand ballroom, her posture composed yet her mind restless. The event was as extravagant as one would expect from the Carter family, a gathering of wealth, power, and whispered ambitions. She wasn't intimidated by any of it. She had spent years navigating rooms like this, but tonight was different because of him. Alexander Carter stood near the bar, effortlessly commanding attention. He was the kind of man whose presence demanded space, whose confidence didn't need to be spoken. Dressed in a tailored black suit, he exuded power, his chiseled jawline and sharp features only adding to the aura of control he carried. Emily hated that she noticed, and yet when their eyes met, a current of electricity passed between them, undeniable, intense, and dangerous. Alexander smirked, a slow, knowing curve of his lips that sent a thrill down her spine. He took a sip of his whiskey, never breaking eye contact. The invitation was clear. She lifted her chin, refusing to let him affect her. But before she could turn away, he was already walking toward her, his steps deliberate, unhurried, like a predator stalking its prey. "Enjoying the party, Miss Munro?" His voice was deep, smooth, laced with amusement. Emily arched a brow, her pulse betraying her controlled exterior. "Is that a genuine question or just an excuse to start a conversation?" Alexander chuckled, the sound rich and unapologetically arrogant. "Does it matter? You haven't looked away from me since I arrived." Emily exhaled sharply, narrowing her gaze. "You're awfully full of yourself. And yet you're still standing here." Damn it. He wasn't wrong. His cologne was intoxicating, sandalwood, and a hint of something darker, something dangerous. The heat radiating from his body felt almost tangible, and the way his eyes roamed over her, slow and assessing, made her stomach tighten. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much he affected her. "If you're expecting me to fall at your feet, Carter, you'll be waiting forever." Alexander tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Good. I don't like things that come too easy." The intensity between them thickened, the world around them fading into background noise. Emily took a step back, needing space before she did something reckless, like lean in to see if those lips felt as sinful as they looked. "Enjoy your night, Carter." And with that, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. But she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The crisp night air brushed against Emily's skin as she stepped onto the balcony, needing a moment to collect herself. Inside, the party continued in full swing. Champagne flowing, conversations buzzing, deals being made behind polished smiles. But none of that mattered right now. Not when the heat of his presence still lingered on her skin. She had barely exhaled when a deep, familiar voice broke through the silence behind her. "Running away already?" Emily closed her eyes briefly before turning around. Alexander Carter leaned against the doorframe, his broad frame illuminated by the soft glow of the city lights. His tie was slightly loosened now, his suit jacket open, revealing the crisp white shirt stretched across his chest. Effortlessly perfect. Damn him. Hardly. She crossed her arms, leveling him with a cool stare. Just needed some fresh air. Or needed a break from me. His smirk was maddening, that cocky self-assurance that most men wore like armor. But on him, it wasn't a shield. It was a weapon. Emily tilted her head, refusing to let him see the way her pulse betrayed her. "You think too highly of yourself." Alexander stepped forward, slow and deliberate, closing the distance between them. "No. I just know when a woman is trying to resist something she wants." The air between them shifted, thickened. The faint hum of the city below, the distant murmur of the party inside, all of it faded into insignificance. Alexander reached out, his fingers barely grazing the inside of her wrist. The touch was light, almost a ghost of contact, but it sent a pulse of heat straight through her veins. "Tell me to leave, Emily." His voice was softer now, lower, more dangerous. She knew she should. She should say something sharp, something cutting, turn on her heel and walk away before this turned into something reckless. But she didn't. She didn't move. She didn't speak. And Alexander knew exactly what that meant. A knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his lips as he lifted his hand. His knuckles brushing along her jawline, a touch so delicate it made her shiver. "That's what I thought." His mouth was close now, too close, his breath warm against her skin. Emily clenched her hands into fists at her sides, fighting the overwhelming urge to lean in, to surrender to the fire that simmered between them. "You're playing a dangerous game, Carter." His fingers traced the curve of her jaw before slipping down to rest against the side of her neck, the pad of his thumb pressing lightly against her pulse point. "Then let's see who loses first." Emily's breath hitched as his lips hovered just over hers, an agonizing moment of hesitation before a voice called from inside, snapping the moment in half. Emily stepped back, breaking free from the intoxicating pull of him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Alexander exhaled, his jaw clenching briefly before his smirk returned, slower this time, darker. "Enjoy your night, Monroe." His voice was rough, edged with something unspoken. She didn't trust herself to respond, not when her body still vibrated from his touch. So instead, she turned and disappeared into the party, knowing one thing with absolute certainty: this was far from over. Emily's heartbeat hadn't slowed since she left the balcony. She moved through the grand ballroom with practiced ease, exchanging polite smiles and measured conversation, but her mind was elsewhere. On him. She could still feel the ghost of his touch against her skin, the way his fingers had traced her jawline, with an intimacy that left her breathless, the way his voice had wrapped around her like silk and fire, daring her to push him away. And yet, she hadn't. Damn him. She exhaled sharply, reaching for a champagne flute from a passing waiter. The cold glass did nothing to cool the heat still simmering beneath her skin. "Drinking to forget me already?" The deep voice sent a shiver down her spine before she could stop it. Emily turned her head slowly, already knowing what she would find. Alexander. Standing too close, eyes dark and dangerous, his smirk playing at the edge of his lips, like he already knew exactly how he affected her. She lifted her glass in mock salute. "Drinking to remind myself that I don't play games with men like you." His smirk deepened. Liar. Emily's breath hitched when he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers as he took her glass and brought it to his own lips, drinking from the same spot where her lipstick stained the rim. Her stomach clenched at the intimate gesture. Alexander lowered the glass, his gaze locked onto hers, unreadable, unwavering. "You taste better." Heat pooled low in her belly, but she forced herself to tilt her head in feigned indifference. "You're relentless." He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "And you like it." Emily clenched her jaw, refusing to let him see just how right he was. But Alexander wasn't the type of man who needed words. He could read her body, the way her pulse fluttered against her throat, the way her lips parted involuntarily when he got too close. He knew. His fingers skimmed along her wrist, sending another jolt of electricity through her veins. "Tell me to stop." Her lips parted, but no words came. Damn it. Alexander's smirk was victorious, but there was something else there. Something darker, something dangerous. "That's what I thought." His voice was a whisper against her skin. Before she could react, before she could process the fire licking up her spine, he was gone, slipping back into the crowd like a shadow, leaving her standing there, breathless, frustrated, wanting. Emily Monroe never lost control. But tonight, with Alexander Carter, she was one step away from surrender. Emily clenched her fists, trying to ground herself in reality, but her body still buzzed from Alexander's touch. The way he invaded her space, the way his voice curled around her name like a promise, it was intoxicating. She wasn't the type to fall for men like him. She had spent years building walls, mastering the art of control. But Alexander, he didn't ask for permission to get under her skin. He just did. And damn it, she was letting him. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne, but Emily waved him off. She didn't need alcohol. She needed distance, air, a way to shake him off before she did something reckless. But just as she turned toward the exit, a strong hand wrapped around her wrist. "Leaving so soon?" Her breath caught. Alexander. His grip was firm but not forceful, his thumb barely grazing the inside of her wrist. The contact sent a shiver down her spine, a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. She met his gaze, dark and unreadable, but there was something else flickering there, a challenge. "I told you, Carter, I don't play games." His smirk was slow, sinful. And yet, here we are. Emily exhaled sharply, stepping closer instead of away. If he wanted to test her, fine. She wasn't going to cower under his intensity. "What is it that you want from me?" she asked, voice low, controlled. Alexander's eyes dropped to her lips before returning to hers. "Everything." The word sent a sharp pulse of heat straight through her, but she refused to let it show. She tilted her head, feigning amusement. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering at her jaw. "I know you're stubborn. I know you like to pretend you're in control. I know you feel this." His thumb traced the curve of her cheek, his voice dropping lower. "Just as much as I do." Her breath stilled. He was too close now, his scent, woodsy, masculine, devastating, wrapping around her senses. "Tell me I'm wrong." Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Tell him he's wrong. The words formed in her mind, but they never left her lips. Because he wasn't wrong. And that terrified her. Alexander's smirk deepened, as if he could read every thought racing through her head. "That's what I thought." And just like before, he stepped away, leaving her standing there, breathless, shaken, craving more. Emily's pulse was erratic, her breath uneven, her body betraying every ounce of restraint she tried to maintain. Damn him. No one had ever gotten under her skin like this, like he was peeling her apart layer by layer, exposing things she had spent years burying. She needed to walk away, she needed distance. But then she felt him again. Before she could think, before she could react, Alexander was behind her, close, too close. His warmth pressed against her back, his breath ghosting along her ear. "You're still here." His voice was a low rasp, dripping with amusement, with certainty. Emily clenched her jaw, keeping her back straight, refusing to let him see how much his proximity unraveled her. "I don't run from men like you." Alexander chuckled, the sound vibrating through her spine. "Good, because I don't chase." The confidence in his voice sent a shiver down her skin. He didn't chase, because he didn't have to, because people just gave in. But Emily Monroe didn't surrender. Or at least she never had before. Then his fingers brushed along her arm, light, teasing. A touch that shouldn't have felt so devastating but did. "You're shaking. You're imagining things." Alexander hummed, unconvinced. His fingertips trailed up her arm, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. When he reached the curve of her neck, he paused, his thumb tracing the spot where her pulse beat erratically beneath her skin. "I don't think I am." Emily swallowed hard, her lips parting, but no sound came out. She felt his mouth so close, the warmth of his breath skating over her skin as he murmured, "Tell me to stop." God, she should. But instead, her fingers clenched into fists at her sides, her body betraying her as a sharp breath escaped her lips. Not in protest, but in need. And Alexander knew it. His lips curled against the curve of her jaw before pressing a slow, lingering kiss there. "That's what I thought." Emily's entire body lit on fire. She turned in one sharp motion, grabbing the front of his shirt, forcing him to meet her gaze. If he wanted to play with fire, fine. "You think you know everything, Carter?" she whispered, her breath uneven. His smirk was lethal. "I know you want me to kiss you." Emily stared at him, at the arrogance in his dark eyes, at the absolute certainty in his voice. And then she made a choice. She kissed him first. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't soft. It was a war, a battle for dominance, one neither of them wanted to win, because losing meant falling. Alexander groaned against her mouth, his hands gripping her hips, pulling her against him so hard she felt every line of his body pressed to hers. Her fingers threaded into his hair, tugging. He growled in response, deepening the kiss, taking everything she gave him and more. Heat, hunger, need. It was reckless. It was inevitable. And it was only the beginning. The world outside blurred into insignificance. There was only this. Only the fire between them, the taste of recklessness, the sharp edge of need that neither of them could deny any longer. Emily barely had time to process how dangerously fast things were spiraling before Alexander took control. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her flush against him, his body hard, demanding. His mouth dominated hers, deepening the kiss with a hunger that burned. Emily gasped against his lips, her nails digging into his shoulders as his tongue slid against hers, a slow, torturous tease that sent a jolt of electricity straight through her. God, he tasted like sin. Her mind screamed for control, but her body, it was already lost. Alexander's fingers traced the line of her spine, his touch deliberate, possessive, igniting heat wherever it landed. "You don't fight fair," she breathed, her voice uneven as he pulled away just enough to meet her gaze. His smirk was devastating, his eyes dark with intent. "Neither do you." Then he moved. His lips traveled along her jaw, down the curve of her neck, slow, unhurried, savoring. His breath was warm against her skin, the maddening scrape of his teeth sending a sharp tremor through her. Emily bit her lip, but he caught it. "Don't hide from me," he murmured, his thumb brushing against her bottom lip. "I want to hear you." A dangerous promise flickered in his eyes, and she knew. This man didn't just take. He demanded surrender. Her pulse hammered as his fingers slid lower, his touch feather-light, teasing, knowing. Emily should have stopped this, should have walked away before she got too deep. But when Alexander crushed his mouth to hers again, his hands gripping her body like he never planned to let go, she knew. It was already too late. Emily's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, her body completely consumed by the fire Alexander ignited with every touch. There was no room for logic, no space for second thoughts. His hands roamed her body with a deliberate slowness, fingers tracing the outline of her curves as if committing them to memory. Every caress, every brush of his lips against her skin set her ablaze. Her fingers fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, refusing to let go. His scent, woodsy, dark, addictive, filled her lungs, making her dizzy with need. "You're shaking." His voice was low, rough, dripping with satisfaction. Emily met his gaze, her nails pressing against his shoulders, her body betraying every ounce of resistance she once thought she had. "Because you won't stop touching me," Alexander smirked, his thumbs sweeping along her jaw before tilting her chin up to him. "Tell me you don't want this." She opened her mouth, ready to lie, ready to push him away before this spiraled even further out of control. But the words never came. Because she did want this, more than she'd ever admit. "That's what I thought." His lips crashed against hers, fierce, demanding, utterly consuming. Emily gasped into the kiss, her hands gripping his shirt, pulling at the fabric, desperate to feel the heat of his skin beneath her fingertips. Alexander's grip tightened around her waist, pressing her against him, letting her feel exactly what she did to him. A deep groan rumbled from his chest when her nails scraped against the back of his neck, and in response, he nipped at her bottom lip, his control hanging by a thread. "You drive me insane," he muttered against her mouth, his breath heavy, his fingers digging into her hips. Emily's pulse pounded as she pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, dark, intense, brimming with raw, unrestrained desire. She should have been scared of this, of how easily he unraveled her. But instead, she whispered, "Then stop holding back." Alexander's jaw tensed for a brief moment, as if her words snapped the last bit of restraint he had left. And then, he obeyed. Emily barely had time to take a breath before Alexander took what was already his. His mouth crashed against hers, his hands gripping her body with a possessive desperation that set her ablaze. There was no hesitation, no space left between them, only heat, raw and consuming. His fingers slid down her spine, slow and deliberate, his touch a contrast to the urgency in his kiss. He was devouring her, unraveling her piece by piece, and she let him. "You're mine." The words were rough, growled against her skin as he trailed his lips down her jaw, across the sensitive spot just below her ear. His teeth grazed, his tongue soothed, and she trembled. Her hands found the front of his shirt, gripping the fabric, pulling him closer, as if there could ever be enough closeness. His body was solid against hers, heat radiating through every inch of him. and she was drowning in it. "Say it, Emily." His voice was low, commanding, a demand she wasn't ready to fight. Her lips parted, but her breath hitched when his fingers skimmed along the bare skin of her waist, tracing fire across her flesh. She should resist. She should fight this. But when his mouth found hers again, deeper this time, darker, she shattered. "Yours." The word was barely a whisper, but it was all he needed. Alexander groaned, his hands tightening on her body, his control slipping. He kissed her like he was claiming something that had always belonged to him. Emily no longer cared about consequences, about control. She had lost herself completely, and for the first time, she didn't want to be found. Emily felt herself sinking, not just into him, but into something far more dangerous. Alexander's hands were everywhere, tracing every inch of her with a maddening slowness. His touch was a brand, his kisses a vow. He wasn't just taking her, he was consuming her. And God help her, she wanted it. Her nails raked down his back as his lips trailed down her neck, his breath hot, teasing, relentless. A satisfied hum rumbled in his chest as he pressed against her, letting her feel the weight of his need, hard, unyielding, completely hers. "Tell me you feel this." His voice was rough, his fingers pressing into her hips, pulling her closer, deeper into the storm. Emily's body betrayed her before she could speak, arching against him, letting out a breathless sigh as her fingers tangled in his hair. "I feel it." The words escaped her in a whisper, but they were enough to ruin them both. Alexander cursed under his breath before capturing her mouth again, his kiss more punishing, more desperate. There was no space for hesitation, no room left for restraint. He wanted all of her, and she was already his. Her hands slid beneath his shirt, feeling the heat of his skin, the way his muscles tensed beneath her touch. Every inch of him was taut with need, his control unraveling at her fingertips. "You're playing with fire, Monroe." His breath was uneven, his lips brushing against her ear. Emily's pulse pounded as she met his gaze, dark and unreadable. "Then burn me, Carter." A slow, wicked smirk curved his lips before he did exactly that. Emily didn't recognize herself anymore. The woman who always had control, who never let herself slip. She was gone. In her place was someone completely undone, someone whose body no longer belonged to logic or restraint, only to him. Alexander's lips were everywhere, tracing, tasting, devouring. His touch sent shivers down her spine, each caress slow, measured, like he was savoring the way she fell apart beneath him. "You drive me insane." His voice was raw, his grip tightening around her waist, pulling her against him like he never planned to let go. Emily's hands roamed his body, nails scraping against muscle, feeling the taut strength beneath her fingertips. Every inch of him was rigid, coiled with desire, with an unspoken need that mirrored her own. Her breath caught when his fingers skimmed along her skin, feather-light yet devastating. He wasn't just touching her, he was learning her, memorizing every gasp, every tremor. Her lips parted as he leaned in, his mouth brushing against the sensitive spot below her ear, his voice a dangerous whisper. "Say my name." She exhaled sharply, her body arching involuntarily. She didn't want to give him that power, but when his hands gripped her hips, his lips trailing fire down her neck, she broke. "Alexander!" A low growl rumbled in his chest, and in one swift movement, he had her pinned beneath him, his eyes burning into hers with something primal. Again. She swallowed hard, her heart slamming against her ribs. This was dangerous, this was reckless, but she had already fallen, and there was no going back. Emily was drowning, not in fear, not in doubt, but in him. Alexander's body pressed against hers, heat radiating from every inch of him. He was everywhere. His hands, his mouth, the raw hunger in his gaze, all of it consumed her. "You're shaking." His voice was dark, rough, dripping with satisfaction. Emily swallowed hard, her fingers curling into his shirt as if holding onto something solid could keep her grounded. But nothing about him was safe. He was fire, and she was already burning. "You're imagining things." His smirk was slow, knowing. "Liar." Before she could protest, his lips crashed against hers, demanding, claiming, taking. There was no hesitation, no room for second thoughts, only need, sharp and consuming. Her body arched into him instinctively, a silent surrender she couldn't take back. His hands explored her, memorizing, possessing, his touch igniting every nerve in her body. "Tell me to stop." His breath was hot against her skin, his fingers tracing the curve of her waist, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. Emily's lips parted, her pulse hammering in her ears. She should stop this. But when his mouth found hers again, his control slipping, his hunger bleeding into every kiss, she didn't. Because she didn't want him to. Emily had lost the battle. Her body no longer belonged to logic, her thoughts drowned beneath the heat of him, the weight of his touch, the raw intensity in his gaze, the way he possessed her without even trying. Alexander's hands roamed her body with devastating precision, his fingertips tracing every curve, every tremor, as if committing her to memory. His breath was heavy, his jaw tight, his control hanging by a thread. "I should stop." His voice was rough, strained, a dangerous confession. Emily swallowed, her heart hammering. She knew what he was saying, but when his fingers curled around her waist, his grip tightening, she also knew he wouldn't, and neither would she. Her nails scraped against the back of his neck, pulling him closer, daring him to lose control. His eyes darkened, something primal flashing behind them before he crushed his lips against hers. The kiss was their undoing. It was fierce, desperate, a collision of hunger and surrender. His hands tangled in her hair, his body pressing her into him like he never planned to let go. Every kiss, every breath, every rough whisper against her lips only pulled her deeper until she was completely lost. "Say you're mine." His voice was a command, his lips trailing fire along her throat. Emily exhaled sharply, her resolve shattering beneath him. "I've always been yours." And with that she let herself fall. No more running, no more fear, just Alexander. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the room. Emily stirred, the warmth of the sheets and the lingering scent of him wrapping around her like a second skin. For a moment, she didn't move. She just breathed. The past felt like a dream, a blur of stolen touches and whispered confessions, of reckless decisions and unspoken truths. But when she turned her head and saw Alexander beside her, his bare chest rising and falling with each steady breath, she knew it was real, and there was no going back. He wasn't just a moment of weakness, he wasn't just a mistake. He was her downfall, and maybe, just maybe, she was his too. Alexander stirred, his fingers reaching for her before his eyes even opened, as if his body knew she was there, as if letting go wasn't an option. His gaze met hers, dark and unreadable, and for the first time, there were no games, no power struggles. Just them. "Morning," he murmured, voice rough from sleep, but still dripping with the same authority that made her body hum. Emily smirked, brushing a hand through his tousled hair. "So what happens now?" Alexander's grip tightened around her waist, pulling her against him, his lips barely grazing hers in a slow, torturous tease. "Now?" His smirk was wicked. "Now, you're mine." And God help her. She didn't want to belong to anyone else. Some desires are meant to be denied, others, they consume you. Emily and Alexander thought they could fight it. They thought they could walk away. But passion doesn't follow rules, and neither does love wrapped in fire. Now tell me, what would you have done in Emily's place? Would you have fought it, man, or fallen? Let me know in the comments. And if you loved this story, there's another dangerously intense romance waiting for you on screen. Click now and dive into another tale of love, temptation, and no way out.